Thank you. Senator Ludlam.
Madam Acting Deputy President, it's with some dismay that I rise yet again. This is the third parliamentary sitting spell in a row where this issue has been brought before the chamber, and it just feels as though we go further down the rabbit hole each time. I have listened very carefully to the contributions of the coalition, and I would also like to note for the record, and perhaps things will change, the fact that not a single government senator has turned up to defend this policy, apart from Senator Lundy, who carried the can for the minister in this place last time this issue was debated. Where are they out there defending the policy? The one thing I will acknowledge is the insufferable smugness of the coalition senators who've turned up in here to claim the policy of their own. I will acknowledge that. Understood. I get it. You're broadcasting it loud and clear that the government has taken on your policy, so you're in here doing the government's job of defending the miserable state of the debate that it's got to. Senator Bernardi and those who contributed before him have made it very, very clear what the talking points are here. We've got the Labor Party on offshore processing, and now we're going to have you on temporary protection visas and towing the boats back into open waters. I heard the minister earlier, I guess it was during question time, say very clearly that the government won't be following the coalition down that particular rabbit hole of temporary protection visas and towing boats back into open waters. But guess what? I have no idea what to believe anymore as far as the government is concerned. Maybe they will join Senator Bernardi and his other two legs of the stool. Terrifying contraption although it is. For all we know, perhaps, Senator Cash, you will get your way and the government will follow you down this to the bottom of the bucket and reintroduce temporary protection visas, or probably for the sake of argument they'll call them something else, and maybe they even will go against the express advice of the Australian Navy, who have said do not force us to turn boats back because it's dangerous to the people on the boats and it's dangerous to naval personnel. Who knows? Maybe the government will complete the triple backflip and go where you're insisting they go, and guess what? The boats will keep coming. I was expecting, and call me naive, some degree of reflection on the fact that since this policy was announced and then introduced, several thousand people have continued to put themselves in harm's way on these boats to come to the country, despite the fact that these prison islands are now being made mandatory, and these tents in the jungle and these tents on concrete pads are being prepared even as we speak. We know that that news is percolating through the camps and that people are still attempting these journeys because even a tent on Nauru is safer than the places that they're fleeing from. So you could introduce TPVs if you want. You could introduce towing back the boats against the express advice of the Royal Australian Navy, and people will still come. I won't expect anybody to come in here then and admit that you were wrong, but you're wrong. We hear a lot of talk about a regional solution to the movement of displaced people. Senator Bernardi, in the middle of the spite and polemic, did actually raise some points about why people come, and I think those are worth addressing. To have any chances of success, a regional solution will involve supporting human rights in the countries of refugees and, of course, in those in which they pass through on their way to Australia. So let's cease and desist from future invasions in far-flung parts of the world that we barely understand, that then lead to outflows of refugees that then find their way into Australia. Let's stand up for human rights in places like Sri Lanka, where there was ethnic cleansing and the massacres of hundreds and then thousands of people who are still making their way in varying degrees of trauma to Australia. Reforming, perhaps the most importantly, reforming Australia's asylum application system abroad so that it is no longer so prohibitively slow, and boosting Australia's humanitarian intake, because I think hope rather than fear is the answer. Senator Hanson-Young and Senator Milne have made this point over and over again, but it seems worth repeating because those on the other side of the chamber don't appear to be hearing it. Rather than the department circulating these daft little YouTube videos saying how terrifying Australia is and how much barbed wire we are surrounding the country with, why not circulate in the transit camps the fact that we have lifted the refugee intake, that we will need to lift it again, I think, inevitably, and that there is safe passage out of these camps, that you can turn up there, you won't be buried there indefinitely, eventually you will be given a safe place to resettle and a safe way to get here. That is the kind of news that undercuts the business model of the people smugglers, if we want to descend to that kind of language. That is what will give people hope. They know very well the kinds of risks that they're taking when they put themselves on these boats. This is broadcast from one end of the region to the other. If the department thinks that cooking up these dopey little YouTube videos to persuade people that Australia is a place of crocodiles and sharks is scarier than politically motivated violence in Iran or ethnic cleansing in Sri Lanka or war in Afghanistan. They are absolutely delusional. The policies weren't the solution when they were introduced by the coalition. It's remarkable the degree to which the coalition just pretend that the CIVEX never occurred. The reason they do that, of course, is that it doesn't fit with the narrative that they stopped the boats, that these harsh policies designed to deflect people from seeking our shores were in fact effective in the first place, because of course the CIVEX sank 2 months after the Pacific solution was introduced. Nauru did not deter them. It won't deter them again. We know that it won't. We've got now a month's worth of evidence, or more than that if you take it from the announcement of the policy, that this form of deterrent simply won't work, because as I said in my contribution the week before last, we have to be more of a deterrent than war, violence, ethnic cleansing, torture and the risk of drowning. Maybe Senator Cash and Senator Bernardi, who have led the charge on this, have some ideas for how Australia can be scarier than those things. And heaven help us all if you end up on the front bench in a future government. The policies that you introduced were not the solution then, they are not the solution now. Because since the announcement with so much fanfare, we're now seeing both the major parties backing away from the deterrent, the instantaneous deterrent value that was meant to be implied with the passage of this policy. 2,049 more people have arrived by boat seeking refuge in this country from exactly the same dire international circumstances that they were seeking refuge from before this policy was introduced. So sure, you folks are getting to score some very interesting points in the domestic media. You're getting probably great runs on Talkback Radio and Alan Jones' station in Western Sydney, and good luck to you for that. However, it is making no difference whatsoever in the real world, in the terrible circumstances and wars and displacements of people which are forcing people to seek asylum in places like Australia. And if you think a YouTube video is more frightening than Pashtun nationalists or Taliban insurgents in Afghanistan and the Swat Valley, if you think a YouTube video is more frightening than the Rajapaksa government of Sri Lanka, which has been implicated in war crimes, or the way that the Iranian state treats pro-democracy dissidents in Irania, you are out of your minds. Statistics can be dry, but the figures that are involved, I think, are quite instructive. It was delightful to hear Senator Humphreys refer to the proud Liberal traditions of allowing people into this country. And of course he was referring to changes that were made when the Fraser government was in power. Former Prime Minister, the Honourable Malcolm Fraser, was sitting in the public gallery when Senator Hanson-Young made her contribution in the last dishonourable phase of this debate, and he certainly wasn't cheering on Senator Humphreys or the arguments that are being made now. You have so unmoored yourselves from the principles of liberalism that now your former Prime Minister has utterly divorced himself from the direction in which you've taken the debate. But it is worth, I think, taking a look at what was done then when huge numbers of people flowed out of Indochina fleeing a war, another war that Australia was implicated in, carpet bombing of Southeast Asian cities by a great and powerful neighbour, the United States. But from after a relatively high number of asylum seekers arriving by boat in Australia subsequent to the end of the Vietnam War, one of the last disastrous occupations we allowed ourselves to get dragged into, there was actually a prolonged quiet period. From 1981 until 1992, the number of refugees arriving by boat never exceeded 214 in any given year. In 1999, 7 years after the mandatory detention of asylum seekers was introduced, there was a spike in numbers to 3,721. I know that amnesia does tend to prevail in this debate, but let's remind ourselves the whole concept of mandatory detention was supposed to be the disincentive. Does anybody remember that? That's just dismally failed. We no longer have room on the mainland to put people. And so that is what has provoked this idea that we can simply divorce ourselves from the problem and dump people in concentration camps on Pacific Islands overseas because of the deterrent value of onshore processing, of dumping people in cages in the desert in Australia was so utterly ineffective. But we can let amnesia prevail, and perhaps it does help you folk in getting hits on Alan Jones' radio program and in the Daily Telly. But it has no bearing to reality at all. If mandatory detention was needlessly introduced after a decade of very small numbers of people arriving, then why did the numbers go up 7 years after the deterrent started? Well, Actually, Kabul fell to the Taliban in 1996. In 2011, the number of people seeking asylum in Australia fell by 9%, almost all of which, incidentally, was in boat arrivals, from about 6,500 to 4,500. Now, that happened without temporary protection visas, it happened without Nauru, it happened without the Malaysia solution. No analysis from either side of this chamber as to why that could be the case. I'd be interested to know whether, in fact, anybody else in this debate is even interested in that steep drop in boat arrivals, or why the number went up again this year despite no change in policy from one year to the next. And in fact, it's more to do with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the presidential election in Iran, subsequent protests and crackdown, the saffron revolution in Burma, which saw huge numbers of people flow across into Thailand and elsewhere, and the end of the brutal civil war in Sri Lanka. These things are what play crucial roles in flows of people seeking to escape violence and repression. And you hear it sometimes dismissed as with a wave of the hand, as, oh yes, the push factors, yeah, we've thought of those. But of course they don't play on the talkback radio stations that you're using to dog whistle the Australian people into submission, believing, as everybody in this country believed, that if only the parliament could do something, we could stop the flow of people away from the horror of war. So perhaps, or I think it's readily evident that people in this chamber don't see any political capital in acknowledging the factors that the ebb and flow of people out of war and disaster zones has nothing to do with the degraded state of domestic policies or the way that this debate is being conducted from the Prime Minister down. There are more than 8,000 asylum seekers in Indonesia, and in fact the unofficial figure goes much higher than that. And the UN Refugee Agency's annual budget in Indonesia is, of course, a mere $6 million. Fascinated to hear the numerically illiterate Senator Bernardi telling us that the Greens' policies of not building these prison cages all over the Pacific and in remote parts of Australia will save billions of dollars. I've just been informed that it's been estimated that just to put Nauru together is going to cost $1.5 billion a year for the next 10 years. Now, how Senator Bernardi comes to the conclusion that simply raising the humanitarian intake and dismantling the suppressive infrastructure of barbed wire cages and surveillance cameras would somehow be more expensive than what we are establishing, and what this act of this chamber today would seek to establish is absolutely beyond me. An immediate increase in UNHCR funding of $10 million from Australia, which is a rounding error compared with what we're proposing to spend on these new institutions, would increase their capacity, would greatly increase their capacity to assess asylum applications. Australia accepts 60 people on average from Indonesia and Malaysia every year, and the pressure to risk a dangerous boat journey builds to boiling point quickly. If you arrive in these camps, as many of us have said before, and what you hear from people who've been there a while before you is, you're stuck, you're not leaving, there is no queue, it's just a dumping ground for people. Imagine if news were percolating through those camps that if you're patient, you will eventually be resettled. And of course that was exactly the situation that prevailed during the years of the Fraser government. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't instantaneous that people arrived and they were instantly transshipped to Australia or other resettlement countries, but people knew that they would be safe, they would be fed, they would be looked after, their human rights wouldn't be abused, and eventually they would find a home where their applications either could be assessed directly or they were being assessed in the places where they were. That is what a former Liberal Prime Minister did, and it's kind of horrifying actually to hear Senator Humphreys invoke that tradition in defence of the degraded state of the debate today, where the coalition have managed to drag the Labor Party across to their side of the debate to completely own and control the terms of the debate, and are now sitting there with smug expressions on their faces, looking at an empty ALP bench because nobody has turned up in here to defend this atrocious policy. No wonder they feel smug. Offshore, I do apologise to the ALP members who are here, and I invite you to stand up and defend what you're doing. I suspect you won't, but you'd be entirely welcome to do so. But I do acknowledge there are two ALP senators in here who've stayed silent and avoided eye contact for the entire duration of the debate. Offshore detention is as harsh as it is pointless, and it won't stop people coming. All it will do is damage the people who are locked up. People who are locked up without knowing when they will be released, why they are being locked up in the first place, or even if they will be released. They're locked up without breaking any law, international or Australian, as has been established time and again, and the Leader of Opposition can remind his Senate colleagues if they ask him, because he's been fortunately taken to task on this once or twice. Asylum seekers are not illegal immigrants. The way international law has prevailed over the last few decades is that it is not illegal to seek refuge in a country that is not your own if you've been forced to leave by those kinds of circumstances. It's been repeated so often that, again, I believe amnesia simply prevails. The fact that reinstituting temporary protection visas will simply increase the number of women and children who find themselves on these nasty little boats in the open ocean. But that hasn't deterred the coalition from saying to the government, we've got you on offshore processing, now you need to come at us with temporary protection visas and towing boats back. That'll fix things, except it won't, but it serves your purposes and it serves your talking points for today. We know that temporary protection visas were the reason that so many children were on board the Civex when it went down, with all hands, with everybody on board. The idea of temporary protection visas is simply bankrupt. And, of course, we support government spokespeople, and Senator Evans was eloquently at it again today, as he has been over the last little while, saying, well, the Australian government won't be doing that. The Labor Party won't be doing that. If only we could believe the government when it says that, because maybe in 6 weeks' time the coalition will have dragged you even further down into the gutter. And lastly, on turning back the boats, for heaven's sake, if you're not going to listen to the Navy and to the personnel who have done this under previous governments and faced the risk and the situations that invokes when you're towing back boats full of desperate people back into open waters, noticing that the talking points obviously say when it's safe, except it isn't, towing back boats without adequate navigation systems, without decent crews that are patently unseaworthy in some cases, back into open waters. The Indonesian government has said don't you dare, and confirmed that it would not accept the towing back of asylum seeker boats to its shores. And the Indonesian government also doesn't have the search and rescue and the inshore naval capacity to be able to look after these vessels if they are dragged back into Indonesian waters. But the Royal Australian Navy itself has said to Tony Abbott, don't be stupid, don't put our personnel at risk in these situations. This is not hypothetical, this is not some kind of abstract argument. The Navy has been involved in 11 attempts to turn back boats between September the 8th and December the 11th, 2001. So we've got an interesting little slice when you had your way, when people like Senator Bernardi and Senator Cash had their way and boats were being towed back. And it's very easy for Mr Abbott to just wave his hand and issue another one of these empty slogans, as he is so wont to do. But we know what happened. On Civ 5, a riot erupted among passengers and a fire was lit on the boat, endangering the passengers and the naval personnel. Civ 7, when told of their return, a number of passengers jumped into the water and then had to be rescued by Australian sailors, putting their well-being at risk. A couple of the boats, according to the Navy, were turned back with relatively little trouble. On some of them, fires were lit on the vessel, passengers jumped overboard, so that's Civ 12. And in the other 7 interceptions, a return was abandoned because of damage to the boats, danger to naval personnel or the passengers, or because of other safety of life at sea obligations. And we have heard senior naval and ex-naval spokespeople, people who have been on the front line of the kind of policy blunders that the coalition are trying to lead us straight back into, that it is operationally extraordinarily fraught and risky, not just to the people on the boat, to everybody in here has professed we're trying to look after their welfare, but it's fraught and risky for the Navy as well. Professor of International Law at ANU, Donald Rothwell, has also put on the record that the policy of towing boats back is utterly contrary to international law. Now, we recognise that the coalition long ago abandoned any pretence of caring. It has been extraordinarily disappointing to see the government go into bat to basically overturn a High Court ruling which emphasised that treating people in this way was unlawful. But here we are. For what it's worth, turning boats back at sea, apart from being risky to the people on the small boats and the people in the Navy doing the work, is also illegal at international law. The European Court of Human Rights affirmed that earlier this year in the Hersey case when they found against an Italian policy of intercepting migrant boats in the Mediterranean and returning them to Libya. Australia is not alone in this. We can do better than this, and this is not the last time that this issue will have to be dealt with in this chamber.